He tried to intimidate Pam Bondi in court. 10 minutes later, he was begging for mercy in handcuffs. The judge thought he had power over everyone. Until he met a woman who would not be broken by any pressure. When he humiliated her in the courtroom, he did not know that she would destroy his career in front of the whole country. Post in the comments, where are you watching from? Pam Bondi stepped out of her car and into the ornate corridors of the federal courthouse with the measured elegance of a seasoned warrior. A prosecutor general whose reputation for uncompromising integrity and relentless pursuit of justice preceded her. Known throughout the nation for her razor-sharp intellect, direct manner, and an unyielding stand against corruption, Pam exuded a quiet authority as she strode through marble halls and past polished brass fixtures. Her every step conveyed purpose and certainty. She was a woman who had long made it her duty to defend the people, even if that meant challenging the very pillars of a flawed system. Today was different. The courthouse buzzed with expectation, its atmosphere thick with the weight of a high-stakes case that had ignited public debate across the country. This case pitted Pam Bondi against some of the most influential figures in the legal establishment, a shadowy network of corrupt officials and crooked interests that had tiptoed their way into the corridors of power. At the center of this morass stood one man whose name had long been synonymous with judicial malpractice. Federal Judge Harold Brown. A veteran of the bench with decades of whispered rumors about his backdoor dealings, Judge Brown had built his career on a foundation of influence, favoritism, and a brazen disregard for the very principles that the justice system was meant to uphold. As Pam entered the courtroom, her presence transformed the space. Clad in a tailored navy blue suit that accentuated her steady composure and wearing a pair of subtle yet commanding glasses that lent her an air of intellectual prowess, she took her designated seat at the table reserved for the prosecution. Her eyes, focused and clear, scanned the surroundings calmly as she reviewed the case files one last time. The whispers in the hall corridors acknowledged her reputation. Whispers of whispered victories against corruption and of ruthless investigations that had dismantled criminal networks while leaving no stone unturned. Today, those murmurs would gain new momentum. Across from her, seated behind an imposing desk adorned with the insignia of federal authority, sat Judge Harold Brown. His expression, though masked by the practiced neutrality expected of a man in his position, betrayed subtle signs of arrogance and entitlement. A slight smirk played upon his lips as he flipped through the docket, as if he regarded the proceedings as little more than a trivial formality, a stage upon which he could parade his power. His eyes, however, quickly narrowed upon catching sight of Pam Bondi's steely gaze as she prepared to speak. It was a silent challenge that required no words. In that electrified moment, Pam made it clear that she expected nothing less than absolute adherence to the law, regardless of his venerable office. The courtroom itself was a witness to a clash of wills. Rows of benches attended by reporters, legal aides, and an anxious public watched with bated breath. The room was filled with an air of expectancy, a collective anticipation of a showdown that went far beyond partisan politics and petty rivalries. Pam's team, a motley assortment of determined young associates and weathered investigators, sat poised at her side. They had labored for months on an expansive parallel inquiry into the systemic corruption that had infiltrated the judicial system, amassing troves of evidence that promised to unravel decades of cover-ups. Every file, every meticulously gathered piece of testimony was a tribute to her unyielding commitment to truth. Judge Brown, noticing the small stir in the room, rose slightly and cleared his throat, a habitual gesture that many interpreted as a reminder of his authority. His tone, when he finally addressed the court, was thinly veiled with threats disguised as legal warnings. Prosecutor Bondi, I expect that you will adhere to the decorum of this proceedings and refrain from any statements that might be construed as inflammatory, he intoned with a haughty air. His words were delivered not as a request, but as an order, a thinly veiled warning to rein in any attempts to subvert his authority. In response, Pam's eyes flashed with cool determination. In a voice steady and calm, she replied, Your Honor, I am here to present the truth. If protecting it threatens decorum, then perhaps it is the decorum that needs protecting. Her tone, measured and unyielding, reverberated through the courtroom like a clarion call. In that charged moment, as the judge's words hung in the air, the first sparks of a confrontation were kindled. Pam Bondi's unwavering confidence, honed by years of fighting for justice against insurmountable odds, set the stage for what would soon become a dramatic reckoning. Unbeknownst to those assembled, her team had been quietly working on a parallel investigation into Judge Brown's long-hidden misdeeds, and today was poised to be the day when the truth would begin to unravel the protective veneer of a corrupt judicial system. As the session commenced, Pam listened intently to the opening statements, every detail of the case presented as part of a broader narrative of abuse of power. With each argument laid out before the court, her mind recalled countless hours spent combing through financial records, secret communications, and confidential testimonies extracted by her tenacious investigative team. Her quiet focus was unbroken, even as Judge Brown intermittently interrupted, his voice rising imperiously as he attempted to steer the proceedings in a manner that would silence her probing questions. But Pam was beyond intimidation. Her presence was a testament to the fact that, in her eyes, truth and justice were non-negotiable, principles that no amount of judicial posturing could suppress. Every gesture, every measured word from Pam resonated with the promise of accountability. To the public and to every court official who had long been complicit in covering up corruption, her appearance in that courtroom was a beacon of hope. It was a reminder that even the highest echelons of power were not above the law, and that when a principled prosecutor stands firm against injustice, the scales will eventually tip toward what is right. And so, as the session unfolded with the tension of impending conflict, Pam Bondi remained resolute, a symbol of unassailable integrity in a system desperate for reform. The atmosphere in the courtroom quickly shifted from an air of cautious expectation to one of frayed tension as Judge Harold Brown rose to assert his authority. With a voice honed by years of wielding power, he barked out his first command, his tone laced with a threat that was intended to unsettle, even intimidate Pam Bondi. Prosecutor Bondi, you are hereby ordered to cease your line of questioning and refrain from any remarks that might be construed as inflammatory against this court or its members, he declared, his eyes glinting with a mixture of condescension and veiled menace. For a split second, the murmurs in the gallery died down as everyone waited to see how Bondi would respond. The silence was broken only by the sharp rasp of a distant clock ticking in the background. In that charged moment, Bondi's gaze never wavered from the judge. Calmly, with an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, she met his challenge. Her voice, measured and steady as ever, sliced through the tension. Your Honor, you have just signed your own sentence. Those words, simple yet incendiary, rippled through the courtroom like a spark that threatened to ignite a conflagration of truth. There was no raised volume, no overt defiance in her tone, only the cool certainty of a woman who knew that sound evidence and unassailable facts were mightier than any intimidating edict. Judge Brown's eyes narrowed in disbelief and irritation, his swagger momentarily faltering. He attempted to interject, his attempt to buttress his authority faltering as Bondi's unwavering calm undermined his credentials. I don't think you understand the limits of this court, prosecutor, he hissed, trying to regain control of the proceedings. But Pam's rebuttal was swift and measured. I understand the law all too well, Your Honor. It is the corruption within our system that has always remained beyond the grasp of those who abuse their power, she stated, and for the briefest moment, the gallery sensed the tension between raw ambition and righteous justice. Unbeknownst to Judge Brown and many present in the courtroom, Bondi's team had been methodically gathering evidence long before today's hearing. Over the past several months, her investigators had worked undercover, collecting damning documents, recording confidential statements, and securing testimony from brave insiders, court clerks, administrative aides, and whistleblowing legal professionals, whose names were now safely shielded by the protective cloak of confidentiality. In a series of flashbacks that whispered through the recesses of her memory, Bondi recalled those early mornings spent poring over bank statements that painted a grim picture of misappropriated funds, the hushed conversations in quiet coffee shops where former clerks revealed secret ledgers, and the overt testimonies of those who had been silenced by fear. Each fragment of evidence contributed to a mounting case that would soon unravel the carefully constructed facade of Judge Brown's corrupt ties. As Bondi's words reverberated through the courtroom, the resilient spirit of justice seemed to grow palpable, galvanizing reporters, legal aides, and even members of the public in attendance. Social media feeds and live blogs, broadcast in real time from every available angle, started lighting up with snippets of her resolute declaration, a stark counterpoint to the deep-seated arrogance of a judge who had spent decades treating corruption as though it were a hidden inconvenience to be brushed aside. It was in that moment that the tide had begun to turn. The judge's finely guarded control was slowly beginning to erode as public pressure mounted not only from the gallery but from a far-reaching network of investigative journalists and civic watchdogs who had been following Bondi's relentless pursuit of the truth. Inside the hearing room, Judge Brown's attempts to continue his draconian suppression became increasingly erratic. "You will abide by these rules or I will hold you in contempt," he sneered, as if threatening the very foundation of her argument. However, instead of retreating under his heavy-handed insistence, Bondi's reply was laced with quiet determination and an implicit promise of consequences. "I have every right to expose the truth, Your Honor, truth that I believe will soon render any further instructions moot," she said. Her measured tone carried a foreshadowing of the impending revelations, as if she were speaking on behalf of every soul who had ever been victimized by corruption. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as eyes shifted nervously toward the judge. Even some of his staunch supporters in the corridors of legal elites began to exchange uncertain looks. Meanwhile, Bondi's team smoothed out their final preparations at the back of the room. A series of coordinated actions had been set in motion. Confidential informants were ready to step forward as soon as a signal was given. Additional evidence had been primed to fly onto screens in real time, and federal investigators had been alerted to the possibility that Judge Brown's long-hidden crimes might soon come crashing down. The atmosphere was electric. A stage was set not only for a legal confrontation but for a monumental awakening in the public eye. As the session moved forward, Bondi continued her case with a cold, clinical precision honed by a lifetime dedicated to justice. Every argument she made, every piece of evidence she referenced, was delivered with the assurance that the truth could not be silenced. Each document she produced was a nail in the coffin of the judge's once unassailable reputation. Her calm resolve contrasted sharply with Judge Brown's increasingly frantic attempts to maintain order. A man who, until this moment, had commanded the room with the trappings of power, now found his authority beginning to fracture under the repelling force of accountability. And so, in that charged courtroom, as the scales of justice started to tilt inexorably in favor of transparency, the seeds of a parallel investigation, meticulously nurtured for months, began to bear undeniable fruit. Pam Bondi stood as the unwavering, principled spearhead of a movement that would not tolerate corruption. With every passing moment, it became ever clearer that no amount of intimidation could stop the relentless pursuit of the truth. A truth that, like an avalanche, was gathering momentum to sweep away the tarnished remnants of a corrupt legal system. As the courtroom drama unfolded outside, Pam Bondi's steely composure concealed a labyrinth of investigations that had been underway long before this fateful day. Flashbacks, vivid and relentless, revealed the painstaking work that had gradually dismantled Judge Harold Brown's long-established network of corruption. It began in the quiet hours of early mornings when Pam's investigative team would comb through reams of court documents and financial records. In a dimly lit office cluttered with overflowing file cabinets and humming computers, junior investigators traced the hidden pathways of illicit transactions embedded in the judge's administrative workflow. One memory lingered with Bondi. A rainy afternoon in an unmarked parking lot where a former court clerk, trembling yet determined, handed over a manila envelope stuffed with photocopies of internal memos and secret ledgers. The clerk explained in a hushed tone that for years, Judge Brown had been receiving gifts disguised as administrative fees and consultancy charges from influential law firms and certain corporate entities with vested interests in a series of questionable rulings. This illicit income, the clerk confided, allowed him to build a private empire behind the solemn mask of judicial authority. Later that day, Bondi met with an investigative journalist renowned for fearless reporting on corruption. In a cramped, smoke-filled diner, The journalist slid a USB drive across the table. There, on the drive, were digital copies of incriminating emails, messages that revealed secret meetings, kickbacks, and promises of preferential treatment in exchange for silence. With every email, Bondi's resolve hardened. The judge's network wasn't just a case of minor misconduct. It was a sprawling operation designed to shield high-level corruption and undermine public trust in the justice system. Her investigation further uncovered testimonies from court clerks who described how internal records were routinely manipulated. One such clerk recalled sneaking into his supervisor's office late one night and finding a ledger that listed flagged cases and the corresponding amounts of money transferred into accounts linked to Judge Brown's offshore entities. The ledger, with its cryptic annotations and dated entries, was a damning piece of evidence. It revealed that the judge had set aside millions from settlement funds and case fees, rerouting them into corporate shell companies that mysteriously vanished from regulatory oversight. These revelations were nothing if not methodical. Flashbacks showed Bondi poring over these documents under the glare of a flickering desk lamp. Beside her lay handwritten notes, meticulously organized into timelines that connected seemingly disparate financial transactions to specific rulings and decisions. Each note was a testament to long nights spent untangling a web of deceit that spanned years. With the clarity of a master strategist, she began to chart the intricate map of corruption that implicated not only Judge Brown but several others in the judicial system. Every anomaly in an invoice, every unexplained change in budget allocations, became a thread in a tapestry of systemic abuse. In one particularly haunting flashback, Bondi remembered receiving a call at midnight from an attorney who had, on the condition of anonymity, detailed how his client, a small business owner ruined by a predatory lawsuit, was forced into bankruptcy by a wrongful ruling that was later found to have been influenced by backdoor deals. The attorney's voice, thick with frustration and resignation, detailed that the judge had not only sanctioned the ruling but had personally intervened at the last minute, ensuring that the decision favored powerful corporate interests over justice. The client's dreams had been shattered that night, and a community had been left scarred by the betrayal of a system meant to protect them. Parallel to this mounting mountain of evidence, Pam's team had been quietly engaging with social media and grassroots networks. Rumors of misdeeds in the lower courts had begun circulating widely, and as her evidence emerged, public sentiment slowly turned. Online forums lit up with discussions of the Brown files, and local news outlets started running exposés that referenced anonymous leaks corroborated by Bondi's findings. Every piece of evidence added to her case painted a picture of a man who had operated above the law. Bonds of trust within the judicial system were fracturing as internal whistleblowers began to step forward. A group of former clerks posted online statements describing a culture of silence, where any attempt to question irregularities was met with intimidation and threats. The turning point in her investigation came when a federal investigation was quietly initiated. Under cover of secrecy, special agents were dispatched to review the judge's financial records and scrutinize the transactions flagged by Bondi's team. With each forensic audit, the hidden labyrinth of bribery and misappropriation grew clearer. Digital footprints, once erased by clever obfuscation, reappeared in the form of bank statements and email timestamps that definitively placed Judge Brown at the center of a corruption nexus. As the evidence mounted, even those within the hallowed halls of the courthouse began to murmur their doubts. Rumors of Judge Brown's prior undisclosed associations with influential businessmen and politicians circulated, and it became evident that his safeguard was not the sanctity of the law, but his network of connections that had lumped him into an untouchable class. Throughout these flashbacks, Pam Bondi remained the unwavering anchor of the investigation. Her steady presence in every step of the process, interviewing witnesses, coordinating with journalists, and ensuring the chain of custody for every crucial document, became a symbol of her relentless quest for truth. In quiet moments, away from the glare of public scrutiny, she would reflect on the personal cost of her crusade. The long hours had been grueling, and the emotional toll was profound, yet every sacrifice was justified by the imperative that justice must prevail. As these revelations started to spill into public view, the tide of support for Bondi swelled. Prominent legal figures, advocacy groups, and even ordinary citizens took to social media and public rallies to voice their outrage over the systemic corruption this investigation exposed. The glowing accountability presented by Pam Bondi had not only built an ironclad case against Judge Brown, but also ignited a movement for judicial reform. Every leaked document, every recorded testimony, resonated with the public's growing demand for transparency and fairness. In the midst of an unfolding scandal and with the echoes of the victims' voices galvanizing the nation, it was now clear that Judge Harold Brown's days of manipulating the scales of justice were numbered. The evidence, as relentless as the march of time, was set to bring him crashing down. The stage was being meticulously prepared for the next phase of the trial, a phase in which the true depth of his corruption would be laid bare before the world, and where the long-suppressed truth would finally force a reckoning in the highest echelons of the judicial system. As Pam Bondi laid bare the damning evidence against Judge Harold Brown, the courtroom scene quickly morphed from a tense legal confrontation into a full-blown crucible of public indignation. Outside the stony facade of the courthouse, news outlets and social media platforms erupted with headlines and live streams, "Corrupt Judge Exposed," and "Justice for the People. No More Corruption." The fervor was not contained within those marble walls. It spilled over into the streets. Inside the courtroom, Judge Brown's aura of impenetrable authority began to crumble. With each additional document presented by Bondi, detailed ledgers, incriminating emails, and confidential testimonies, the once confident judge fumbled for control. His smooth, rehearsed demeanor gave way to subtle signs of panic. His eyes darted nervously as he struggled to dismiss new evidence that painted a damning tally of illicit kickbacks, forged contracts, and secret offshore transactions. Years of cushioned influence and unquestioned power now appeared as brittle illusions, rapidly disintegrating before the relentless pressure of undeniable proof. In a series of flashbacks interwoven with the courtroom drama, the audience was shown the painstaking work behind Bondi's investigation. In those shadowed moments, she was seen poring over stacks of confidential files in cluttered back-office rooms. Former clerks whispered details of clandestine meetings where Judge Brown had accepted gifts in exchange for favorable rulings, and a trusted informant recounted a late-night rendezvous in a dimly lit parking garage, where secret ledgers were passed under the cover of darkness. Every piece of evidence bolstered her case, building an intricate web that tied the judge to a sprawling network of corruption. The flashbacks underscored not only her meticulous dedication to the truth but also the high stakes. The very integrity of the judicial system itself was under siege. As this evidence resonated in the public domain, the pressure on Judge Brown intensified beyond the courthouse walls. Social media platforms lit up with viral posts, and respected legal commentators, once reticent, now denounced the judge's practices in fiery op-eds. Hashtags such as #CleanTheCourts and #NoMoreBrown began trending nationwide, mobilizing ordinary citizens and advocacy groups alike. Protests flared outside the courthouse. Dozens, then hundreds of protesters gathered, waving signs that chanted, "Justice for the people," and "Corruption ends now." Their voices, amplified through live broadcasts, passed across the country, creating an unstoppable wave of accountability that even seasoned insiders could no longer ignore. Within the courtroom, Judge Brown's inner panic was palpable. His usual rapid-fire dismissals devolved into halting, defensive retorts. He attempted to intimidate witnesses with stern gestures and abrupt interruptions, but his efforts only further exposed cracks in his network of influence. Longtime aides shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, their faces betraying anxiety as the once-feared judge now lost his commanding grip on the proceedings. Whispered conversations among the jurors revealed that his attempts at suppression were failing, that the truth, meticulously assembled by Bondi and her team, was overpowering any remnants of his former authority. Pam Bondi, unconcerned by his desperate maneuvers, pressed on with clinical precision. She methodically presented a timeline correlating the judge's decisions with vast, irregular financial disbursements that, when mapped out, depicted a deliberate pattern of misappropriation. "Each fraudulent entry you see," she stated in her calm, measured tone, "is a testament to the shattered dreams of countless families. Every dollar embezzled is a life derailed." Her words resonated deeply, not only with the stunned courtroom but also with the ever-growing audience watching online, infusing the nation with a renewed appetite for justice. The intensity in the courtroom built to a crescendo as more corroborative evidence surfaced. A series of leaked memos from an embattled law clerk and a recorded conversation in which Judge Brown casually discussed covering up unfavorable reports. With each new revelation, public sentiment shifted decidedly against him. There was no hiding behind accustomed flattery or institutional inertia. The judge's long-standing ties to corrupt entities were now splintering under the relentless scrutiny of an awakened populace. Amid this whirlwind of emerging evidence and external pressure, even members of Brown's inner circle began to withdraw their support. Influential figures once allied with him started issuing quiet statements urging complete transparency. Reports emerged that federal investigators were looking into irregularities not only in his rulings but also in the personal bank accounts tied to clandestine offshore entities. The judge's protective network, once a fortress built over decades, was cracking, leaving him increasingly isolated and vulnerable. At that pivotal moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom transcended legal formalities. It became an arena where unchecked corruption was being publicly shamed. Pam Bondi, standing unwavering at the forefront of this monumental case, served as a beacon of righteous defiance. With every fact, every document she presented, she sent a clear message. The corrupt, regardless of their position or power, would no longer be allowed to operate with impunity. As the session drew to a close for the day, the combined forces of media scrutiny, public protest, and the relentless tenacity of Bondi's staff signaled that the judicial system was on the cusp of a transformative reckoning. The tide of justice was turning, and even Judge Brown's most fervent attempts to salvage his reputation were futile in the face of a truth that now resonated across every level of society. The stage was firmly set for the final act, a confrontation that would not only determine the fate of one man, but also chart a new course for the integrity of the judicial system. The day for the final session had arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thicker than ever. Every seat was filled. The gallery, the media, and thousands watching online contributed to an almost palpable electricity that crackled through the halls of justice. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, her posture resolute and her eyes fixed unflinchingly on the court as if daring anyone to challenge her integrity. Today, she was prepared to deliver the final, indisputable evidence that would shatter the criminal shield built around Judge Harold Brown. Before the session began, the air was heavy with whispered rehearsals and hushed conversations among her team. Senior investigators, paralegals, and even a few whistleblowers whose courage had risked everything to bring the truth to light exchanged determined looks. They knew that all months of sleepless nights and painstaking work had culminated in this moment. As the doors of the courtroom closed and silence exhaled over the chamber, the spotlight shifted completely to Bondi. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Pam Bondi rose from her seat. With a calm resolve that belied the intensity of the moment, she projected her voice so that every corner of the room could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of this court, what you are about to witness is the culmination of a relentless pursuit for truth and justice." The courtroom fell under her hypnotic cadence. She reached into a clearly labeled briefcase and sequentially presented a stack of voluminous evidence materials. Leaked internal memos, digitally time-stamped emails, financial spreadsheets detailing millions of dollars siphoned away through bogus administrative fees, and, most damning of all, video testimonies from former clerks and startled insiders. Her finger traced the margins of a particularly explosive email, a digital document that showed Judge Brown explicitly approving a series of clandestine transactions intended to funnel funds into offshore accounts. This email, Bondi intoned slowly, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that judicial misconduct extends further than mere negligence. It reveals a deliberate manipulation of financial orders for personal gain. Every fraudulent entry, every manipulated ledger entry you see here, is a record of lives ruined, trust shattered, and the very sanctity of our judicial system compromised. Her words cut through the courtroom, and for a brief, charged moment, even the rigid countenance of the corrupt judge betrayed hints of discomfort. The evidence was projected on the courtroom screen, vividly displaying charts and annotated figures. A montage of recorded conversations played, a sequence capturing the judge's callous whispers discussing cover-ups with influential figures, the murmur of money transferring hands without accountability. As each clip played, gasps echoed from the audience while cameras flared from every possible angle, capturing every nuance of the oral and visual onslaught. Bondi then turned her attention to a series of witness statements, signed affidavits from former court clerks and junior legal aides who testified about the culture of silence enforced by Judge Brown's intimidating reign. Their testimonies detailed instances of threats, bribes, and even disappearances of documents that could have exonerated innocent parties. In a move that seemed calculated to leave no room for doubt, Bondi presented the final piece of her case, a confidential report from a special task force within the Federal Investigation Unit. The report detailed an independent forensic audit of Judge Brown's accounts and graft, concluding that his misconduct was systemic and far-reaching. "This report," she declared, "is the definitive audit of judicial integrity. It asserts with unassailable certainty that corruption within this bench extends to the highest levels of influence. Make no mistake, these are not isolated lapses but a consistent pattern of abuse of power." Her voice, steady as a metronome, reverberated around the room, affirming that the truth could no longer be suppressed by hidden deals or anonymous threats. As Bondi articulated her final statements, the collective energy in the room surged. Eyes turned toward Judge Brown, who now sat stoically behind his bench but could no longer hide the tremor creeping into his voice. His earlier haughty demeanor had dissolved into visible anxiety. In between clenching his jaw and darting glances at his legal counsel, he began to fumble with his notes and appeared increasingly isolated under the relentless scrutiny of both Bondi's evidence and the public's watchful gaze streaming in live. The gallery erupted with murmurs of approval and indignation. Journalists quickly scribbled down every word while social media feeds lit up with updates, comments, and hashtags demanding accountability. Pam Bondi's unwavering commitment to justice in that courtroom transcended the confines of legal procedure. It became a defining moment where the oppressed and voiceless saw their suffering validated, and those who had shielded corruption braced for an inevitable reckoning. Every document, every recorded conversation, and every witness account had, until now, been a puzzle piece in a giant mosaic of corruption. With clarity and measured precision, Bondi assembled those pieces into a narrative that left no room for alternative interpretations. She delivered her closing remark in a voice that was both firm and compassionate. "Let this overwhelming evidence be the dawn that pierces the darkness of institutional corruption. We are here not simply to condemn a single individual, but to reaffirm that the law, spoken through unwavering truth, will always prevail over tyranny and greed." As her words resonated through the now charged silence, the courtroom transformed from a mere room of judicial formalities into a stage for history. The final evidence had been laid bare. Every person present, be they a frightened witness, a determined journalist, or an ordinary citizen tuned in online, knew that the scales of justice were inches away from tipping irrevocably. With the decisive power of truth behind her, Pam Bondi had turned the courtroom into a battlefield where corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, would not go unchallenged. The atmosphere in the courtroom, already fraught with tension and righteous fury, reached a fever pitch as Pam Bondi's damning presentation set in motion events that would soon expose long-hidden secrets. No sooner had she laid out the final indisputable evidence, a digital dossier of correspondences, financial records, and recorded conversations that traced the judge's corrupt web, than an unexpected commotion rippled at the back of the room. Murmurs of disbelief were quickly overtaken by a palpable sensation of impending justice as the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, admitting a team of stern-faced federal agents clad in dark suits and armed with official badges. Their presence, broadcast live by dozens of media cameras already poised outside, sent an electric shock of anticipation through every person present. In that moment, as if summoned by the inexorable force of truth and accountability, the agents moved with military precision. They advanced in unison, their measured steps echoing in the hall like a drumbeat of finality. The murmurs from the gallery turned to gasps of awe and relief. Every eye, from the tear-stained faces of victims' relatives to the determined journalists clinging to every frame on their live streams, was fixed on what was about to unfold. Judge Harold Brown, whose once imposing presence had dominated the courtroom with arrogance and calculated disdain, now sat transfixed in his high-backed chair. For the first time that day, his finely wrought mask of invincibility began to falter. Under the relentless scrutiny of Pam Bondi's evidence and the searing eyes of the public, his condescending smirk wavered into a look of stark disbelief and mounting dread. As the lead federal agent stepped forward and announced in a firm, controlled tone, "Judge Brown, you are under arrest for corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice." The courtroom fell into an eerie, anticipatory silence, a silence that spoke louder than any protest or shout. In that breathless moment, the corrupted judge's facade of authority crumbled visibly. His usually steady hands began to tremble as if trying in vain to erase the mounting evidence etched into public record. Slowly, inexorably, he rose from the bench, his movements clumsy and desperate. The federal agents swiftly approached. One of them produced a pair of gleaming handcuffs. As they locked the cuffs around his wrists, a ripple of shock passed through the room. Shock mingled with pity, anger, and a deep-seated sense of vindication. Judge Brown's eyes, once coldly calculating, now filled with tears. The sight of those glistening droplets sliding down his weathered face was both pitiful and cathartic, a manifestation of the heavy price of corruption. He shifted uneasily, his voice cracking as he attempted to muster words that might redeem him. "Your Honor, please, I beg you," he stammered, his tone feeble and almost inaudible compared to the roar of justice that filled the chamber. But there was no room for mercy in a courtroom where the truth had finally triumphed over deceit. His whispered pleas were lost in the growing clamor, a collective outcry of disgruntled citizens, impassioned reporters, and officials who had long waited for this moment of reckoning. Pam Bondi, watching the spectacle with a calm yet resolute demeanor, maintained her steady gaze, the unwavering beacon of justice that had guided every painstaking step of her investigation. She did not allow even a trace of satisfaction to mar her composed expression. Instead, she regarded the scene with the measured detachment of one who has seen too often the slow decay of moral fabric to celebrate a moment of retribution with overt jubilation. For her, this was not a personal victory, but a solemn obligation fulfilled, a necessary purging of corruption from the hallowed halls of justice. Throughout the courtroom, the mood underwent a radical transformation. The previously oppressive silence, charged with tension and manipulated by the hubris of a corrupt official, had given way to a cacophony of reactions. Journalists scribbled furiously as live feeds zoomed in on Judge Brown's tear-streaked face and the resolute expression of Pam Bondi behind the prosecution's table. Social media erupted in a frenzy. Hashtags like #JusticeServed, #EndCorruption, and #NewDawnForJustice began trending, echoing the sentiment of millions who had long grown weary of a system that repeatedly allowed the powerful to shield themselves from accountability. Members of the public, who had gathered outside the courthouse in anticipation of change, cheered and waved signs proclaiming "Truth prevails" and "The corrupt fall." Within the confines of the courtroom, the enraged murmurs from the gallery turned into palpable cries of relief and vindication. The families who had suffered under the weight of unjust rulings and orchestrated deceit, whose lives had been sabotaged by the machinations of Judge Brown, felt a collective, emotional catharsis. Tears mingled with smiles as the long-suppressed yearning for justice found its overdue moment of expression. Even some individuals from inside the legal establishment, once hesitant to question the status quo, now visibly expressed their support. A few even whispered words of encouragement under their breath, acknowledging that today marked the beginning of a new, more accountable era. For Judge Brown's legal team, the collapse was as devastating as it was inevitable. Their attempts to shield him with legal maneuvering and feigned confidence dissolved in the face of overwhelming evidence and an unyielding federal intervention. Attorneys who had once defended his every move now sat slack-jawed, their earlier bravado replaced by stunned silence. There was no hiding behind cable-knit suits or lofty legal jargon now. The concrete truth had taken center stage. As federal agents escorted Judge Brown from the courtroom, still bound in the unbreakable grip of handcuffs, his downfall became a symbol, a stark reminder that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, would invariably find its reckoning when confronted by unrelenting determination and the unwavering pursuit of truth. The judge's tearful, broken pleas for clemency, half-whispered amidst his desperate attempts to cling to vestiges of power, resonated as a bitter farewell to a career once marked by ostentation and decay. His voice, trembling and diminished, was the final note in an aria of retribution, a sound that would echo in the annals of public memory. In that transformative session, a scene emblazoned with the imagery of a titan brought low, the corridors of power shifted imperceptibly yet irrevocably. The arrest was not simply an act of law enforcement. It was a clarion call to every institution that had once turned a blind eye to malfeasance. It declared, unequivocally, that if you choose to abuse the trust placed in you, if you build your empire on the suffering of the righteous, your time will come. The arrest of Judge Harold Brown was a watershed moment, as pivotal as any in the nation's ongoing quest for transparency and equity. Even as Judge Brown was led away amidst a frenzied mix of media flashes and public acclamation, Pam Bondi stood as the embodiment of stoic resolve. She had not sought personal glory in this moment. Rather, she had fulfilled a sacred duty to the people and the integrity of the justice system. As the echoes of clapping hands, sobbing witnesses, and the determined shouts of protesting citizens filled the chamber, one truth became unassailable. The fall of corruption was inevitable, and today, with unyielding force, justice had been served. The final echoes of Judge Brown's anguished pleas still reverberated in the corridors of the courthouse as Pam Bondi stepped out into the crisp light of early evening. The atmosphere outside was a charged mix of relief, hope, and cautious optimism, with reporters, protesters, and ordinary citizens all gathered to witness the moment when decades of hidden corruption were laid bare. Despite the tumultuous events within, Pam moved with a serene, unyielding composure that had become her trademark, a quiet testament to the power of integrity over intimidation. As she exited the looming stone steps of the federal courthouse, the roar of cameras and microphones surged toward her. A reporter, voice trembling with excitement, called out, "Prosecutor Bondi, what do you have to say now that corruption has been exposed?" For a brief moment, she paused, surveying the throng of eager faces, the glistening eyes of those who had suffered under a system bent on shielding the powerful, and the palpable anticipation that signaled a historic pivot in the nation's quest for justice. With her calm authority intact, Pam spoke, her voice measured yet resonant. Justice is not a spectacle, nor is it a performance to be manipulated for the sake of influence. It is our solemn duty to protect the truth and the dignity of every citizen. Today, we have taken a monumental step in reaffirming that very duty. What you witnessed in that courtroom was the culmination of tireless investigative work, unwavering perseverance, and a commitment to the people that will never yield to the forces of corruption. Her words, delivered with impeccable poise, were met by a wave of approving murmurs from journalists and passers-by alike. In the days that followed, the arrest of Judge Harold Brown surged through every news channel and social media feed. Editorials decried the deep-seated corruption that had been allowed to fester in the upper echelons of the judicial system, and grassroots movements began calling for comprehensive judicial reform. For many, Pam Bondi's steadfast integrity symbolized a new era, a transformative moment when even those who considered themselves untouchable could no longer hide behind titles, wealth, or outdated alliances. Standing beside a temporary press podium, adorned with the insignia of justice and accountability, Pam addressed the gathering media with a deliberate brevity. Our legal system is built not on the whims of the corrupt, but on the unwavering belief that every individual, no matter how powerful, must answer for their actions. Corruption is a cancer that eats away at public trust. It is our duty to excise it, however painful that task may be. Even as her words echoed through the throng of reporters, the faces of citizens in the crowd revealed a shared sentiment, a burning determination to see such recklessness eradicated from the halls of justice for good. As the press conference wrapped up, Pam's inner thoughts ran deep, filled with the memories of countless nights spent poring over confidential documents, coordinating with brave insiders, and relentlessly pursuing leads others were too afraid to chase. Every sleepless hour, every risk taken in the pursuit of truth, had converged on this defining moment. But rather than linger on personal sacrifice, she kept her focus firmly fixed on the collective right of the people to live in a society where power was checked by responsibility, and where justice served was both fair and fearless. Even as the judges and lawyers of old retreated into a world that had long protected the established order, Pam forged a new path, a path defined by accountability and the promise of reform. Her investigative team, bolstered by newfound public trust, began planning subsequent inquiries into other branches of the system, ensuring that no act of corruption would escape scrutiny. Across the nation, legal watchdogs and civic groups rejoiced, marking this moment as a clarion call for systemic change. The fervor grew in community centers, online forums, and legislative halls, each echoing the sentiment that true reform was not a singular event, but the beginning of a long-overdue transformation. In a final, measured remark to the press as the day neared its closure, Pam declared, "Today is not a time for celebration, but a reminder that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing commitment. We have struck a decisive blow against corruption. Yet the fight continues until every crooked corner of our system is illuminated and held accountable." Her voice, steady and sure, lent a hopeful timbre to the moment, a promise that the tyranny of greed would eventually cede to the resolute power of transparency and truth. Walking away from the courthouse, with the setting sun casting long shadows behind her, Pam Bondi embodied the very essence of accountability. Her silhouette merged with a gathering dusk, a symbol of the old ways fading into memory, replaced by the emerging dawn of true justice. In that poignant moment, as the courthouse receded into the backdrop of a rapidly changing world, her parting words rang out clear, carrying with them the weight of a revolution in the making. This is not merely the fall of one judge. It is a signal to the entire system that if you are corrupt, you are next. Subscribe to the channel to witness the next story where truth has the final word.